we should just start. I remember once asking in a minyan somewhere in Israel, when do you daven Ma'ariv? And the answer was, when the impatience of those present exceeds the expectation that more people will arrive, then we start. So I think we should just start. First of all, apologies from our chairman Gabriel Sivan, who has a bad cold. He phoned me earlier, and I could quite clearly hear that he was not as well as he would like to be, and so he apologises, and I said that I would deputise for him, and that I knew the speaker quite well and could quite ably introduce him, so I was quite happy with that. The other thing I said I would do is, I don't know if you all know, but we lost really one of our senior veteran members of our committee last week, Rabbi Raymond Apple, who passed away, and the Levaya was Motzei Shabbat, so they're still sitting Shiva. Raymond really was someone who was totally engaged with our society. He was a frequent speaker, and the books which are just in front of David Young, he really was one of the catalysts for getting things done. He said, we have to do something, keep us occupied during COVID, and he made sure that we progressed with it. He contributed a chapter himself and was always ready to speak. And it was really quite appropriate. I was at the Shiva on the first afternoon, and his son-in-law, between Mincha and Ma'ariv, instead of Hilim or Mishnayot or whatever, he read 4 different short articles that Raymond had written about some of the foibles of Anglo-Jewish ministers and their colleagues, and some of the even larger foibles of some of the members of the synagogues of the United Synagogue in London. It was very appropriate, and it was very much Raymond Apple, and we shall miss him. He was not just somebody who contributed around our table, but he and Marion hosted most of our committee meetings, and when I say hosted them, they were very well hosted, and we were very well looked after. And it may be that we'll be able to have a meeting at some stage in the future to have a tribute to him. So I think I personally know just about everybody here, and is there anybody who hasn't met me before? Yep. Okay, so I think I can start.
I once introduced Yom Mechutan at an encounter conference, and what I did was I said, usually the chairman knows the speaker. Usually the people know the chairman, not the speaker, so the chairman has to introduce the speaker. But everybody knows the chief rabbi better than they know me, so I'll introduce myself. and he very much enjoyed that.
So Ernest Hart, Victorian Polymath, and I really was thinking a little bit before, as I was getting this together, about polymaths in general. And you'll see when I tell the story about how he was involved in everything from medicine to social reform, child welfare, prison service, even a real connoisseur of Japanese art, one of the first connoisseurs of Japanese art in the 19th century. So before there were polymaths, there were people who were reputed to know everything. And I remember once I was in the car in Glasgow, and there was a review of a book about the man called Thomas Young, who was reckoned to be the last Englishman who knew everything, whether it was science, religion, art, the works. He knew everything. And I came home and I said to Irene, I've just had this amazing review about the last man who knew everything. And I was really quite surprised, because I thought we had 2 people in our shul who knew everything. So, Ernest Hart, born, as you see, in 1835, died in 1898 and editor of the BMJ. He was born in London, in Knightsbridge. His father, Septimus Hart, was a dentist. I'm not sure whether he was the seventh son or they'd been in, I don't know. But so that was his father. So they were already middle class, living in a nice area of London by the 1840s, certainly. And as he grew up, his first school, his high school, he went to the City of London School, and he was really noted there to be an outstanding pupil. And not just outstanding pupil, but he actually won a very prestigious scholarship to Cambridge University. And the last two people in this attempt to win this scholarship were Ernest Hart and Harold Seeley. I don't know if any of you have heard of Harold Seeley, but Sir Harold Seeley, as he became, was the most prominent English historian of the Victorian era. So he must have done very well. But he had a problem. Cambridge University in 1850, if you wanted to matriculate and you wanted to graduate from Cambridge, you had to take an oath as an Anglican. So he said he wasn't prepared to do that, and they agreed, Cambridge University agreed that they would transfer the scholarship money to, this is him as a young man, to St George's Hospital Medical School, and so he was the first Jew in England to get a university scholarship, even though he couldn't take it at university. So he studied medicine at St George's, and even as a medical student, during the time of the Crimea War, he was already involved in activities to support the soldiers who were being sent off to the Crimean War. There was probably know that there were major problems about health provision, and he really did his best to make sure that the authorities were informed about what the health needs would be of the servicemen. He started his work as in a sort of general practice. He graduated. He got the MRCS, the membership of the Royal College of Surgeons, which was the standard entry into the medical profession if you weren't at university. And he managed almost immediately to get a position at St George's as an ophthalmic surgeon. So he was already noted to be somebody who had talent. In 1861, he was a founder member of the Medical Society of London, which encouraged the discussion of medical topics by medical students. And having been at the West London Hospital for a little while, he returned to St Mary's, where he worked for several years as an ophthalmic surgeon, then as an ear surgeon, and became Dean of the Medical School at the age of somewhere around about in his 20s. And he was already contributing various papers to learned journals, and he was writing a number of the reports on ophthalmic surgery for Moorfields Hospital. At the same time, and this is already sort of polymath, he's an ear surgeon, he's an eye surgeon, and he was also a bit of a vascular surgeon as well. And he actually published a method of treating popliteal artery aneurysms, although after this he decided that he would focus on the ophthalmic surgery. And during his first 5 years in practice, he was earning about £2,000 a year. Now, £2,000 a year in 1860, I need hardly say it was a lot of money. It's probably a six-figure sum today. So he was already involved with that, and this gave him some money for the beginning of philanthropic activities, with involvement in many medical welfare organisations, and he was providing funds for scholarships and for medical research. He married a woman from Germany, Rosetta Levy, and unfortunately the marriage didn't last very long because she died one day from aconite poisoning. Aconite is a very, very poisonous substance, and is usually in a bottle with a dropper. If I drop that, I think I may have a slide a little later on. And you would take 1 to 3 drops for abdominal complaints. She had at her bedside what was called the black draught, and I've got a slide, I'll show you that later on, which also still exists. It's sold in Britain and in America, and it's more commonly used for sort of gastrointestinal upsets. It's got ginger in it, it's got some turmeric and a few other things. So during the night she reached for the black mixture, and instead of 3 drops of the aconite, of the black draught, she took the aconite instead. And accidental poisonings are still not uncommon, but it's highly toxic. And some of the ones, the aconites that sold with tincture, just with a dropper, you can use it even in children with 1 drop. I wouldn't recommend it, but it still has a license for sale. It's got sedative properties, it can reduce fever, pain and inflammation, but it can cause cardiac arrhythmias. So at night time she seemed fine. In the morning they called the family doctor, and he said she seemed fine. He prescribed a dilute amount of prussic acid, which was also for gastrointestinal complaints. I see Simon is shaking his head. He might not have done anything of the sort, and he wouldn't have had aconite or black draught on the bedside table. But 2 hours after the doctor left, she had presumably a run of ventricular fibrillation, and she died. So the coroner was called, and they had to have a coroner's inquest, and they decided that it was all due to accidental poisoning. And the hearing at the coroner's court, the report was signed by Thomas Wakeley, who was the founder of the Lancet, where Ernest Hart was already working as an assistant editor, but he hadn't actually carried out the details of the inquest himself. It did raise some eyebrows at the time, but Wakeley was a very prominent social reformer, a celebrated coroner who had conducted over 20,000 cases. And there was a bit of gossip, and the gossip continued in subsequent years, partly because people said, didn't Dr. Hart leave the country in a hurry? Well, he did leave the country at one stage, but 8 years later. It was nothing at all to do with this, but once the rumour mill gets going, there's no saying where it might stop. He remarried in 1872 a woman called Alice Rowland, who wasn't Jewish. Alice Rowland had studied medicine herself, one of the first medical students in England, female medical students in England, and she was also interested in social reform. She had an interest with him in Japanese art, and she was somebody who was involved in helping the women who were victims of the terrible famine in Ireland, with the potato famine and so on, and she raised money for that. Her sister is probably better known today, her sister Henrietta, who married a man called Barnett, and as Henrietta Barnett, she was very involved in educational activities in mid-Victorian and later Victorian England. So really 2 sisters who were really very involved. It didn't stop Ernest Hart's activities with Jewish organisations, as we shall see. I should have given this to Irene, and it sounds like my sister, but so this is, so Hart took over the editorship of the BMJ. When he took it over, it was a 20-page it was a 20-page sort of gossip column, just with news about doctors in various parts of the British Isles. By the time that he retired, it was a 64-page medical scientific journal that already had some significant cachet. If you're worried about what aconite looks like if you're walking through the woods somewhere, this is what it looks like. I would steer well clear of it. And the black draft, I was quite surprised to see that if you want it, you can still buy it. This is from America, and senna, licorice, cardamom, and it's still available today. So settling down with his second wife, he really got seriously involved in various kinds of academic journalistic activities. As a young man, he had already been involved in journalism, writing for a paper called Fraser's Magazine, a literary journal whose contributors included Samuel Coleridge, William Makepeace Thackeray, and John Stuart Mill. So he was in distinguished company as being on this list of contributors, and he argued the case for the emancipation of the Jews in Britain. If you remember, you are now allowed the vote. There were a number of changes that came in the late 1850s, but Oxford and Cambridge and higher grades in the army were still restricted by the Test Acts, which effectively kept Jews, Catholics, and English, Welsh non-conformists out of these. So his journalistic career began in 1858 with the Lancet, and he started writing leader articles, doing proofreading, and following medical debates in Parliament. There was a cholera outbreak in the mid-1860s, and he was very involved with that. And he was already looking at conditions in the various workhouses in London and the infirmaries attached to them. However, he had a major fallout in 1866 with the editor of the Lancet, because he felt he was important enough to be the joint editor, and Wakeley didn't want him as joint editor, and the British Medical Association appointed him as editor of the British Medical Journal at an initial salary of £250 a year, which I think was really quite reasonable for something that was meant to be part-time and at that stage. And he remained editor right until the day of his death. He didn't necessarily have an easy ride with it. He was somebody who was a campaigner. And if you were campaigning, I suppose like Dickens did in the Victorian era, for better conditions in workhouses and all the other kind of things, foundling schools and all the rest of it, you didn't necessarily have a very easy time of it. There was an entrenched opposition to many of the things which he was trying to do. So he sort of fell out with a number of people. There was one stage where he decided that he'd had enough of it in 1869, and they begged him to come back in 1870 because they didn't have anybody else who could perform the work that they wanted at the level he could. One of the earliest issues that he took on, you probably know that hysteria is related to the Victorian belief that mental illness in women was partly caused by their genital makeup, and there were various procedures which were, I won't go into any details in mixed company, but there was one surgeon at the time in London who was doing surgery for hysteria, and Hart really took a very strong line against him, and this really ended this particular gynecologist, Isaac Brown's, career. So as I say, he was transforming the BMJ into a major, highly respected mass circulation journal with international prominence, and so he was asked to contribute much to various other journals, the Sanitary Record, the London Medical Record, and he liked to expose what he thought were things that were just not right medically. One of them was hypnotism, and another was the vaccination was already becoming more popular for various conditions, and he was involved with writing for a journal called The Eternal Gullible, and so implying that people who were gullible were going to the hypnotists and were not signing up for vaccinations. Some of his writings on topics such as promotion of vaccination and professional ethics were actually published in book form. At the same time, he got involved in smoke abatement. Now, this has nothing to do with cigarettes, because he remained a cigarette smoker till the end of his life. But it's the fog that enveloped London for the best part of a century, from all the industrial processes, the burning of coal in domestic, and he actually was involved in setting up an organisation to try and reduce the amount of pollution in the atmosphere. He was described as having a strong critical power which dissected and ridiculed worn-out traditions, and because of that he made some enemies and some mistakes, because he conceived that his first duty was not to his colleagues but to the public. So I'm going to quote something from his entry in the Dictionary of National Biography. The writer Bartrip quoted Charles Adams, who took on this feeling that some of the opposition to him wasn't just the policies that he was pushing, but there was a bit of anti-Semitism behind it, which probably wouldn't surprise anyone. I have to apologise for the Victorian language, and you'll see how much English has moved on in the last 150 years. But Charles Adams wrote at the time, to have pushed such a paper as the BMJ into such a position is a feat of which any pressman might be proud. A feat which would hardly have been within the compass of anyone who did not have in his veins the blood of that preeminently pushing race, his connection with which he would seem to be so curiously anxious to ignore. It wasn't all that nice. It was a very, very backhanded compliment, but he clearly got the work done. But Hart was in fact not ignoring his Jewishness, but he was publishing articles on Jewish emancipation. He wrote a book called The Mosaic Code, detailing the laws in Vayikra and Leviticus. And he also wrote about how he couldn't take up medical studies at Cambridge University. One of the articles that he wrote about this when in the era when Jews could enter Oxford and Cambridge, and of course University College London, and the other universities were much more open. He described himself as belonging to a quite prehistoric period, even though he was only 59 years old at the time. So it's a little bit about his social reform, because this really gives you an idea not just of what he was trying to do, but how difficult things were for the poor in London in the mid-Victorian era. He was a member of a commission in 1866 investigating poor law infirmaries, and this led to the formation of the Metropolitan Asylums Board. So with that, and with the position that he got as chairman of the Parliamentary Bills Committee of the British Medical Association, he was able to speak directly to MPs and government ministers about medical and sanitation members. And this provided him the platform for several significant health reforms. One of the great evils of the time were baby farms. I don't know if you're kind of familiar with this, but baby farms were people who had to give up their children, couldn't afford to look after them. And the authorities provided the sum of 2 shillings per week for the care of these children. However, Hart discovered that the provision that was being expended in these child farms was 7p halfpenny a week, and the other shilling and 4p halfpenny was being kept by the people who were running these children's homes. And this was a terrible scandal, and Dickens took up the story in some of it anyway, in Oliver Twist, where he described the children lying on the floor, uncared for, while the women in charge pocketed most of the money for the children's care. I actually discovered an extension of this, and I could hardly believe my eyes when I read this, but you could take insurance on a child that you didn't think would survive. You paid something like a penny a week, and by the time the child died, there would be enough money to pay for the funeral and some money left over to help with the care of the other children. It really, I thought it was quite shocking, but it would seem to be not too uncommon. So, 1881, there was the first of the smoke prevention exhibitions to be held at South Kensington, and the Smoke Abatement Society movement was set up, and this was related to the expanding Victorian manufacturing, which relied heavily on coal. He was also determined to reduce the amount of alcohol being consumed, and he set up coffee taverns and became the coffee taverns director, in the hope that people would go into the coffee taverns which would have the ambience of the pub, but wouldn't sell any alcohol. And they lasted quite successfully for a number of years. The other thing that he got involved in with sanitation was the illnesses spread by infected milk. In 1873, Hart and his family and medical colleagues, including Sir William Jenner, had suffered from a particularly severe outbreak of typhoid, which was the most well-known milk-borne disease in the Victorian era. And at the International Medical Congress in London in 1881, when Hart was president of the British Medical Association, he outlined his epidemiological research over the previous decade, which linked typhoid, scarlet fever and diphtheria to infected milk. And he said that an investigation which had been done in 1873 made it so clear that the then skeptics became converted to believe that there was infection in milk, and its acceptance became universal. Once that was accepted, he set up a medical self-help society, and from this the Medical Sickness Annuity and Life Assurance Society emerged. Politically, he was a liberal, once actually stood for Parliament as a liberal, and when asked at the hustings what his religion was, and he said, and this is a direct quote, "I believe in the one great living God. I was born a Jew, I am living as a Jew, and I shall die as a member of the great and glorious house of Israel." To say that in public, I think that says something. So Hart served on the Poor Law Committee, which was set up in 1896. Henrietta Barnett was also there, and there were many skin conditions, eye infections there because of the closely cramped quarters with the poor health conditions, and also the emotional effects of taking children away from their homes and putting them into these very uncaring, unfeeling institutions. The alternatives of village communities and boarding out with families were all recommended as preferable. The Board of Guardians, there were a number of, not just Jewish Board of Guardians. Board of Guardians was a very widespread organisations, and they were the ones who said that they should be in charge of all the care of pauper children. But Henrietta Barnett and Sir John Gorst recommended that the new authority should be the Education Department. He was invited to attend the first meeting of the Indian Medical Association in Calcutta, which was then the capital of India, in 1894. He attacked the Indian government for its policies on cholera, and his outspokenness was criticised at first, but if anybody's read Simon Shamma's new book on epidemics, he mentions the work of the Jewish expert on cholera vaccine, Vladimir Havkin. He devotes more than 100 pages to him in the book, who was in India just afterwards and managed to organise the vaccination of something like 5 million Indians. Probably not a huge percentage of the population, but it helped a lot to prevent the spread. And he gave a public address in Hyderabad speaking about the risks of illness on the pilgrim's path, the path that Indian Muslims were taking on the way to the Hajj, where cholera was also present. There's a lovely painting by Solomon. This one. Before I do the painting, let me just tell you this story, because it's well worth talking about. I don't know if any of you heard of Julia Franco, whose pen name was Frank Danby. She began her literary career, and in subsequent books, writing about the pettiness, snobbishness, clannishness, and general boorishness of the Jewish inhabitants of Maida Vale. She wrote several novels on the topic, and the first one is this one, Dr. Phillips, a Maida Vale idol. And the story is about a medical journalist practicing in Maida Vale who kills his wife, kills his Jewish wife, and marries a non-Jewish person, his mistress, who is the mother of his illegitimate child. Needless to say, this brought back memories of the death of first Mrs. Hart. This book was published this particular version, not in 1887 like the original was, but in 1989. Stephen Locke was then the editor of the British Medical Journal, and I don't know what drew him to this, but the British Medical Association decided that they were going to reprint some medical classics of an earlier generation, and this was one of the ones that they chose. Stephen Locke really was one of the best editors that the BMJ has had in the 20th century. He said that the accusation that he was attacking Jewish life was unfair. He was only attacking affectation, ostentation, and snobbery. She added a preface in the second edition denying that she was having a go at Judaism. However, it's interesting at the end of Stephen Locke's quite long introduction, he says, "Mysterious is how far Danby based Dr. Phillips on Ernest Hart. Some accounts say that it was pure coincidence. Yet the publishers altered the book's title from its initial one of Dr. Abrams because Hart's middle name was Abram. And in later life, Gilbert Franco, that's the son of the authoress, often stated that his mother had based her protagonist on Hart. But Locke said, does it really matter? Frank Danby's novel is worthy in its own right. Ernest Hart is one of the great medical editors of all time, and if the one draws attention to the other, then we should all be grateful. Stephen Locke, editor BMJ, September 1989. Still, it's I think a slightly strange choice, but there we go. And Julian Franco, I think you probably still be able to buy the BMA version of this book. I'm not sure what else of Julia Franco's is still easily available. That's what it looked like when it appeared. So, and I've read out some of that material there, and I've read out some of that. So, Ernest Hart, in one of the last big campaigns he got involved with, late in life, I mean, he was already had diabetes, he had peripheral vascular disease, he had incipient gangrene in his lower limbs, but he really kept going. He travelled extensively in his last years to Japan, where he was very interested in the art, and he even got admission to one of the royal palaces to see some of the art which is not usually seen by the public. He visited North America, many branches of the American Medical Association, and branches of the British Medical Association, because in the early years in Canada of following independence, the Canadian Medical Association really didn't get going till later, and Montreal particularly had a British Medical Association branch. So in 1897 his right foot was amputated, and as I say, he really kept going until the very end. One or two other things he was involved in just in his last years. Apollinaris. Anybody heard of Apollinaris? It's one of the best-selling mineral spa waters. So in 1872 he was having dinner with George Smith, who was a partner in the publishing Smith Elder and Company, which founded the Dictionary of National Biography. And he recommended Apollinaris, the German naturally sparkling mineral water, which is now owned by Coca-Cola, to Smith. The spring had been discovered by chance a couple of decades earlier in Bad Neuenahr, and the water was named after St. Apollinaris of Ravenna. Smith's business partner, Edward Steinkopf, formed a subsidiary company to sell the water in Britain. Hart became its scientific advisor, but didn't take any shares in the company. I don't think Coca-Cola have Apollinaris on bottles of mineral. You know, they had a major disaster with their first attempt at bottled water when it found it came, I think, out of a tap in Putney or something. So it sort of fell by the wayside. So I should say one or two other things about Hart's art. He was a great grower of roses in his country home in Totteridge, which was far enough out of London to be sort of a country estate. He played chess and pigeon breeding, but his main passion became Japanese art, and his collecting began when he contacted Tadamasa Hayashi, I hope I've pronounced that right, the Japanese art dealer who introduced traditional Japanese art to Europe. From 1882 he became a prominent collector of Japanese art and later joined the Japan Society, giving lectures and writing on the subject, and enjoyed a worldwide reputation for his appreciation of Japanese art, and many of his English essays were translated into Japanese. His collections of lacquerware were said to be one of the finest in Europe. In 1891 he travelled to Japan with his second wife, where he received many honours, and was a founding member of the Council of Japan Society in London in 1891. His wife Alice was also a noted watercolourist, and she also read papers to the Japan Society, the first member to do so. I should mention that he was also took an active part in supporting the movement of women into medicine. Not easy for the editor of the British Medical Journal, which regarded the BMA as a male body and were resistant to the idea of women in the profession. But when the London School of Medicine for Women was opened, he became one of its governors, and he and his wife supplied money for scholarships. He was buried in Willesden. One of his last interests was in the Cremation Society in London. He was one of its founder members, and the first crematorium in London was at Woking. It took years after it was built to get permission to use it, because it required an Act of Parliament. But he was really determined that he should be cremated. He was particularly interested from his visit to Japan, where cremation was the usual method of dealing with the dead. After the first Europeans had made a significant impact in the court in Japan, they decided on burials, and they said that led to pollution in the rivers from effluent from the cemeteries flowing into the rivers, and they went back to cremation. So Hart was really quite sold on this, and he set up meetings of various people where they discussed cremation, and he was probably one of the he wrote a paper on why Jews could be, not just should be, could be cremated, and this is one of the evenings that he held where these subjects were kind of discussed. Painting is by Solomon Joseph Solomon and is called An Octave for Mr. Ernest Hart. Now, some of the names of the people around the table, I don't know if you can read the names, but Sir Henry Thompson was certainly one of the leading figures at the time. I'm sure that Simon can tell you who Spencer Wells was, and if you didn't know Spencer Wells personally, you would know some of his medical products. So this was a fairly distinguished gathering. So, so the journey from Woking to Willesden was organised with the help of Chief Rabbi Herman Adler, who agreed that the ashes could be interned in Willesden. And this is, if you go onto the United Synagogue grave, find a grave page, you can't find Ernest Hart's grave, but I think the photographer managed to get the shade from another gravestone on it, so you can hardly read it. So I actually got in touch with the Willesden, there's a visitor centre there now, and they were quite excited. I sent them a copy of the paper that I'd written for the Journal of Medical Biography, and they've been doing some outreach to many of the organisations which in the wider world, commercial, I got bonus points when we were there because we were asked in our little group what the H in H. Samuel stood for, and I was the only one that knew that it was Harriet Samuel and not wasn't a man that founded the company. So this is at Ernest Hart, and they said, oh, we can invite the BMA to come. That would be very good. And there's plenty of medical people, but to have the editor of the 30-year editor of the BMG. And so at this point, I ask a halakhic opinion of Rabbi Salasnik. If you were in Herman Adler's shoes, what would you have said?
Well, I don't know if this is the actual case, but wasn't there a situation where they agreed that a cremated man, if the ashes were placed in the coffin, could be buried?
That may well.
But there was, at the same time, and I'm not sure exactly which was exactly the same years, there were two of the leading Orthodox rabbis in Germany who were actually discussing this. One saying that we can't do anything in connection with cremation, and the other one saying like this, that they would be willing to bury the ashes provided them in the coffin.
Right, so I presume that the family didn't turn up with an urn and just empty it into the whatever. But anyway, it was certainly that's what was done. Would it still be done today?
I'm not aware of any recent occasion, but let's put it this way: why would a person want to be buried? Want to be buried in the cemetery when they have all these options of going to a crematorium and then being given the ashes to take home if they wish?
Right. I think the answer to that is very much that the 1890s was the first decade of cremations being done. I think in the first few years of Woking there was something like 6 cremations. It really took a number of years before the number of cremations even got into double figures and treble figures. So I think at that stage it was such a novelty that the final decisions really couldn't be made. So Ernest Hart died editor of the British Medical Journal. The obituary had 11 pages. Quite often obituaries stretch to 2 columns, sometimes even to a second page, but I don't think that any other medical professional had an obituary which went to 11 pages. It wasn't just the deputy editor, the head of the British Medical Association, the head of the American Medical Association, medical publishers, colleagues. It really was what you might say. It was the whole Megillah. I mean, they really did everything. And so, interestingly, the American Medical Association published in the journal in German, the Journal of the Medical Association, described how Hart's death had come as a shock to many of his friends, even though his poor health was known. And this is from the American obituary. His death leaves a gap in the ranks of medical journalism which can never be filled. He had an instinctive delicacy of judgment, made few mistakes, and popularised the journal as no man preceding him had been able to do so, and at the same time made it one of the financial successes of the age. He had learned the arts of being aggressive without offending, and the journal under his management has been right in its advocacy of all those reforms in which the whole profession is interested. As a writer, he was forceful, accurate, and aggressive. As a man, he was unassuming, polite, and agreeable. As a physician, he was well informed and in certain lines in advance of his time. He will be greatly missed for his place in medical literature and peculiarly his own. The memorial service was conducted by Henrietta Barnett's husband, who was a canon in Marylebone Parish Church. As I say, the burial of the interment was of the ashes in Worlston. Hart had once said that he hoped to leave the world a little bit of a better place than when he'd found it. And the final thing that he did in his will was to establish the library and reading room in BMA House, and presenting many books and some very valuable, rare first editions, including original works by Vesalius, the great Belgian anatomist of the 16th century, and the Hunter brothers, William and John Hunter. So that's the story of Ernest Hart. Certainly a Victorian polymath deserved that. Did he know everything? He wouldn't have said that he knew everything, but he was nearly there. Thank you. Simon.
Since him, has there ever been a Jewish editor of the BMJ?
I don't think so. I mean, he really was in many ways characterised a one-off. He was felt to be important enough. This was a portrait. This is a photographic portrait, one of the earlier photographic portraits that the National Portrait Gallery has. It was done by a French photographer who made quite a name for himself with his photographs, and he photographed many of the leading figures of the day, including that of the Prince Consort, Albert, which must have been really quite early in the thing. So this is the photographic portraits of Ernest Hart. He was really well regarded for his professional abilities, and he believed what he was doing. He believed that you should do something about infection in milk, and you should do something about pollution in the atmosphere, and you should do something about these child farms.
What about tuberculosis?
Tuberculosis was another interesting thing. I didn't really see that he was much involved with that, but even by that time, there were tuberculosis involved a different group of people. These were usually work people at an age. It's a whole other area.
It's connected with milk.
It's a very complex area. It comes from bovine tuberculosis. It's not always associated with milk. I think I will leave that for another occasion.
It's interesting that he applied to Cambridge to do medicine. He would have known that
no,
he wouldn't
he didn't apply. He applied for the scholarship. He sat for the scholarship.
But he would have known if he had, that getting it, he wouldn't be admitted unless he went through the process.
Some people really like to prove that that if they couldn't have it, it was one more piece in the case for full Jewish emancipation.
Because
it was like the Rothschilds who went into Parliament and wouldn't take the oath, and his constituency kept re-electing him, and it became a celebrated cause, and eventually he was allowed to take the oath without being a Christian gentleman.
So he would have applied in the early 1840s, maybe?
Early 1850s.
50s.
Yeah.
University College, which had been set up in opposition to Cambridge, which didn't require that, was set up in 1824. The medical school was set up in the 1830s, and I'm kind of feeling maybe it hadn't got such a reputation yet at that stage, because it's interesting.
St George's eventually was associated with the University of London.
Yeah, I don't know when.
I'm not sure when. But obviously that's where he chose to study, and in fact it was also a matter of getting the medical school to agree to get the scholarship money that should have gone to Cambridge to St George's. So there was more to it just than these particular applications. You
said that Herman Adler got involved with his burial after the cremation. So how involved was he actually with the Jewish community?
I doubt whether he was a showgoer in any way. However, he was a great speaker, and he was quite often, because of his prominence in Victorian society, he was quite often asked to speak on public occasions. He was the speaker at some of the earliest meetings of the Maccabean Society, from which the kind of the Zionist movement in London grew out of. So he was, if you like, he was a public. He was what you call the reverse Morano. He was a Jew outside, but not so much at home. Okay,
Did he have any children?
There were no children. I should say in the novel, the stepchild, the child of the mistress actually dies as well, and that's part of the pathos of the novel, because Dr. Phillips in his Maidavale idyll is left without a wife, without a mistress, and without a child, and that's how the book ends.
The first wife presumably had relatives.
She had relatives in Germany. She came over from Germany it was an arranged marriage. She came over from Germany.
But do we know if any of them had any, how they responded to the Aconite poison?
I don't know. I didn't find it. Let's say I didn't find anything either in Ernest Hart. There's brief biographies in the Jewish Encyclopedia Judaica, all of them, and there's no mention about her family back in Germany. Hilary.
Just to say, Henrietta Barnett, who was his sister-in-law, yeah?
Yes.
So she set up in the suburb these small cottages so that artisans could live alongside people with money. And she set up the school, which is still there, Henrietta Barnett School. Funnily enough, she was a little bit anti-Semitic. Didn't allow many Jewish girls to go there. She would have been telling in her grave in the mid-60s because the entire school was full of Jewish girls. Not so much now.
Yes, but I think the two sisters were actually very. The two sisters were very close and had a very strong connection of interests in the social reform and so on. So Henrietta Barnett would not have been anti-Semitic.
I don't know so much, because they said that she was very reluctant to let Jewish girls go to the school. There was a quota. There was a quota. And all the cottages that you see up and down Rosewood Road, which now go for huge sums of money, work for the artisan.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's really part of what
What
they were about.
So that everybody could live together in absolute gardens.
Yep.
Is that you?
No, I didn't get that.
Okay, so anyway, Donya is just leaving, but
Did you say something?
I just said you're going to be the next speaker.
All being well, there's not to say.
So the initial notice of it went out with the mailing for the present meeting, but a reminder of the details will come out nearer the time, and I hope by that stage I have a date for the March meeting. And hopefully Professor Ron Rubin, who's an American, who was supposed to have given the opening talk just after Simchat Torah, which but he's back in America just now, but he will be here by May, and he will give the talk that he promised for after the Chagim in October, on Jews in the American press in the colonial era, which he's published a book on, but he's promised, because it's the Jewish Historical Society of England, he will keep it to pre-1776.
Kenneth, that was amazing.
Right, so, and at the back there is tea, and there is...
You haven't changed your vote of thanks?
well, if you want to say something...
Well, I think everybody was exceptionally interested, and it was a wonderful talk.
Okay, so tea, coffee, some biscuits, some fruit, nuts, and I'm happy to wish that to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.